Darkness is a horror-themed first-person shooter based on some comic book I've never heard of. The game is by the delightfully named Starbreeze Studios, whose most notable previous title would be the Chronicles of Riddick Escape from Butcher Bay, in which players piloted a claymation Vin Diesel in his ongoing quest to masturbate himself raw in the faces of audiences worldwide. He awakens in a cemetery where we are told through some shitty exposition that his mafia boss uncle has betrayed him and sent some hitmen to make him dead, presumably because he's sick of having to babysit the gormless fuckwit, and that what I was supposed to do was go back to an easily missed white spot on the ground, use it to summon an evil imp, and instruct it to move a thoughtlessly parked car out of the way of one of the cemetery entrances. Let me just reiterate that. The game literally has me summon a multi-fanged, beclawed monstrosity from the depths of hell, not so I can make it enslave the innocent or lay waste to all worldly nations, but so that I can enlist it as my own personal breakdown service. The Darkness has been getting some pretty good reviews all over the place that use phrases like brilliant storytelling and top-notch presentation, which give me cause to hesitate before I use phrases like monstrous pile of shit. During the development of Fable, for example, it was promised to have features like rival NPC characters, plants growing in real time, and a system wherein your every slightest choice and action changes your appearance in the world around you. What we ended up with was a buggy action RPG with a great big stiffy for itself. Fable is supposed to be all about choice, but it's really just the same choice over and over again between either mawkish virtue or extravagant malevolence with no apparent middle ground. For example, there's a cast of major NPCs whom you run across regularly throughout the adventure, and for virtually all of them there's a point where you can choose between either doing their bidding or slitting their throat. It's an option that personally I appreciated having, but since the game has to find a way to carry on regardless no matter who you murder, no one seems to be that bothered by it, to the point that I could slaughter half the population and people would still be expecting me to defeat the big villain and save the world, then act all surprised when I decide to join him instead.
Nariko certainly wears roughly the same amount of clothing as Kratos in that she's one protruding nail away from a Boris Vallejo painting, but after that the developers seem to go out of their way to defy the comparison. Kratos possessed no hair and a Y chromosome, Nariko has no Y chromosome and hair growing out to about 8 feet long, which flows jerkily behind her like a rope made out of dry tagliatelle. The whole effect does not so much scream battle-hardened swordswoman as it does the phrase try and pull this one off cosplayers. Nariko then turns to some thing sitting vacantly nearby wearing cat ears and makeup apparently applied by a Kiss fan with Parkinson's disease and relays to it her intention to slit up evil dudes. She then adds, with a totally straight face, "We may need you to play twing twang." My first thought when I heard that was I am so going to quote that out of context, but on reflection it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in context either. If the developers were hoping I'd consider buying the full game just to see what twing twang is, then mission fucking accomplished, I suppose, but I'm going to be very disappointed if it isn't a cutesy euphemism for lesbian cunnilingus. Yeah, I went there. The video depicts a white-as-the-driven snow main character from a previous Resident Evil game, in this case Chris Redfield, who has apparently been making an income on the side, smuggling cantaloupe melons in his upper arms, entering an obviously foreign and tangibly dirty peasant village and getting attacked by a scythe and pitchfork-wielding mob of bewitched locals. And if this sounds familiar to you, then you've probably played Resident Evil 4. I want you to take part in a little practical demonstration for me. I want you to find a pen or some other similarly dimensioned object in the Cheeto-scented detritus surrounding your computer keyboard. Pause the video and get one. Seriously, do it. Don't keep watching waiting to see where I'm going with this, just do it. Right. Once you've got one, insert it between the second and third fingers of one of your hands, as shown. Now when I'm finished talking, pause the video again and use your other hand to squeeze your fingers inwards towards the pen. You may have noticed that this really fucking hurts and that you are now in a great amount of pain. Congratulations, you have just received your punishment for not buying Psychonauts. The story goes that while working on Full Throttle for LucasArts, Schaefer envisioned a sequence wherein the main character underwent a peyote-fueled psychological dream subconscious journey thing, but the bigwigs rejected the idea because it wasn't family-friendly enough. Incidentally, the released Full Throttle featured hardcore biker gangs, bludgeoning murder, and more than one person getting chainsawed in the face, so perhaps this was the early warning sign that LucasArts bigwigs are all a bunch of chimps with Down syndrome. We're currently living in the 7th generation of consoles, if Wikipedia is to be believed. 7 generations of feuding and inbreeding like the residents of some backwards Louisiana swamp, and this is around the time the really interesting deformities start setting in. So while we're on the subject, let's start with the Wii. The polar opposite to Nintendo's bewilderingly named, modestly powered little white cuboid is Sony's unoriginally titled monolithic black colossus, the PlayStation 3, a shiny chrome Spider-Man type-faced thing the size of a small car loaded with arguably the most powerful top-of-the-range hardware. But blinging out your console with such things creates the unspoken obligation to also bling out the games with top-of-the-range graphics, which puts production time and costs several months and several $1 million on the side of uncomfortable. This may explain why there are hardly any games out for the bloody thing. Like Nintendo, the PS3 is largely selling on future potential because of the promise of Metal Gear Solid 4 and Final Fantasy 13 at some point, but if Final Fantasy 13 continues the tradition of most new Final Fantasies, then you could probably simulate it just as well by listening to the Star Wars soundtrack while huffing nitrous oxide and reading an Excel spreadsheet. While Sony targets hardcore technology freaks and Nintendo targets gamers who aren't yet old enough to cross the road by themselves, the Xbox 360 has its sights on more of a casual gaming, beer-drinking frat boy demographic, and reflects that with a stack of big tough manly games like Gears of War and Dead Rising, the latter being a game with a difficulty curve like running headlong into a brick wall. The 360 undoubtedly has the strongest lineup of games, which at this point is admittedly like beating two quadruple amputees at swing ball, because it also has a strong back catalogue of Xbox games, or at least it would do if the backwards compatibility wasn't a big load of bullshit and chips. The 360 also has the best online support for the Xbox Live malarkey, although the player base can charitably be described as lively, and uncharitably described as a bunch of hooting dickholes. If my Psychonauts review taught me anything, it's that nobody likes me when I'm being nice to a game, so let me quickly get the praise for Bioshock out of the way first. It's incredibly good looking, but then what isn't these days, brilliantly written, masterfully atmospheric, and resoundingly imaginative, even if thematically it has at best taken a few pointers from Fallout and at worst held it down and bloodily ripped it off. The psi powers are now plasmids, the hybrids are now splicers, and the wrench is now... well, a wrench, but it's a different kind of wrench. Everything that was cyberpunk then is steampunk now, and sometimes it gets a little bit hard to swallow. How exactly does a steam-powered gun turret differentiate between friend and foe? I wasn't aware that boiled water could form allegiances. In the good ending, you're a virtuous flower child with love and a smile for all the shiny-coated beasts of God's kingdom, and in the bad ending, you're some kind of hybrid of Hitler and Skeletor, whose very piss is pure liquid malevolence. The original Tomb Raiders were made by British developers Core Design, but after a while they weren't exactly treating the old girl properly. They basically just made the same game 6 times, with each setting introducing broader and broader definitions of the word tomb, and the series practically died with Angel of Darkness, but the publishers weren't prepared to let something so popular with sweaty 13-year-old boys with holes in their pockets die, so they handed it over to some cheeseburger-inhaling Yanks who announced their intention to remake the first game and do it properly, which, as insults go, is right up there with slapping you in the balls with your own dead dog. In the original intro for Tomb Raider, she responds to the advances of a big lumpy Texan vaguely flirtatiously, while in the new one she has the bog-standard Hollywood tough gal coldness and the threats of violence, because everyone knows action-oriented independent women all munch more carpet than a malfunctioning vacuum cleaner. If you leave her for a while, Lara does these shamefully erotic stretches, and whenever she comes out of water she's realistically wet and glistening. It kinda takes me back to when I was 15 and playing the original Tomb Raider, and I'd back her up into a corner to get the best view of her juicy thighs. I'm given to understand that Vin Diesel is planning to remake Escape from Butcher Bay. I have stuff in my crisper drawer that's older than that game. I mean, is it just because no one can come up with new ideas? It's not hard. Here's one. A genetically engineered Taiwanese chef teams up with a newt in a fez to rescue his large-bosomed girlfriend from mummies. There, you see? It's easy. Controversy in the games industry go hand in hand like Ico and Yoda, if you'll forgive the incredibly nerdy analogy, and like Yoda, the controversy tends to stay focused for an average of about 8 nanoseconds before getting bored and drifting off to do something else. Okay, pressing buttons to shoot guns in, say, Soldier of Fortune is about as far removed from the workings of actual guns as my arse is from the dark side of Europa, but then you have games like Manhunt, which not only have the player viciously maim human beings with a variety of household objects, but also provides detailed and up-close demonstrations on how to achieve the most horrific results. Manhunt expected me to clear out a building full of bad guys, then kill a boss from long distance with a motherfucking shotgun, all in the space of a 2-minute timer. To paraphrase Oscar Wilde, no chance, you unreasonable dicks. I hope you won't mind if I put on my new games journalism hat for a moment, but I was pretty thrown when my editor asked me to review Peggle. Peggle is one of the new breed of casual games, and like most casual games, there's not a lot you can say about it. Unlike normal games, there isn't any dreadful voice acting or inevitable sewer level to take the piss out of. What I can say about it is that I started playing it around noon and emerged from my room sometime later to find that the authorities had declared me legally dead. I'm going to go out on a limb here and presume that you, the viewer, have had a mother at some point, and you may at some point have seen her attempt to play a mainstream video game. In most cases, this is like watching a cat trying to fly a kite. In summary, it's okay, I guess. I preferred Bookworm Adventures, but then I'm one of those hopeless mutants who genuinely enjoys playing Scrabble. It seems that all the other game reviewers in the world have put me in an awkward position, bunch of cock-eaters to a man as they are. Most if not all of them seem to have played a jewel-encrusted golden gift from the treasure vaults of Xerxes, but I played a game that I'd probably only have considered renting if it weren't for those suckers at the Escapist paying for all my games now. The difficulty is also rather inconsistent, which probably comes from the design team being large enough to found a small island nation. The difficulty curve wavers up and down like the knickers of an indecisive whore before plunging dramatically into a Sunday stroll down Easy Street for the last hour or so. There were sequences really near the beginning that kicked my ass until I was wearing my buttocks like a hat, while the closest thing to a final boss fight is basically you versus a wheelchair-bound cross-eyed hobbit and you're armed with the BFG 9000. On one occasion it was my jeep versus an enemy tank, but the clueless pillock at the turret seemed more interested in shooting down nearby butterflies. Eventually I got out and took the turret myself, ordering my passenger to take the driver's seat, whereupon he immediately drove us smack into a wall and sat there picking his nose while the enemy leisurely blew us to Narnia. A game that is supposed to be perfect wouldn't need anything to excuse it. Quod erat demonstrandum, said Yahtzee, like the big literary fag that he is. Things got off to a flying start on the character creation screen when I discovered that I could choose the colour of my starting armour, so I immediately kitted myself out with an ensemble of fluorescent pink and a matching Ace Ventura hairdo. Then, mindful of the fact that the duty of a beta tester was to try and break the game, I decided to test out Tabula Rasa's obscenity filter by naming my creation Gareth Gobblecock. No sooner had Gareth minced into the first world than he was given a series of quests to kill specific numbers of local wildlife X, Y, and Z in return for new, slightly better guns and armour, which swiftly replaced all of my starting
plotting armor, destroying Gareth's individuality, and raising the question of why they let me choose custom colors in the first place. Besides, every MMO so far has its grind right up the bum, and it doesn't seem to stop people playing them. Some people just like that sort of thing, I guess. Some people also find fat people sexy. I don't understand them myself, but then most people don't understand why I like putting lettuce around my cock and hiding it in other people's salad. But now the waiting's over and I could gleefully sit down to enjoy the latest adventures of everyone's favourite emotionally oblivious mute, Gordon Freeman. Then 6 hours later I had to stand up again because I'd finished it. I can't help feeling that Valve have missed the point of episodic gaming somewhat. The whole idea is to mix up the usual rigmarole of game publishing by having shorter games at lower prices released more frequently, and while they have aspects 1 and 2 down, they continue to struggle with 3. A new character is brought in without warning and everyone acts like we've always known him. It's actually quite perplexing. Valve have done a great job making us empathise with all the major NPCs so far, so being introduced to a new one at this late stage is like coming home from school to find a walrus sitting at the family dinner table and you're the only one who seems to notice. If you like blazing action peppered with variety and cleverness, you could do a hell of a lot worse than Half-Life 2 Episode 2, Manchester United 0. Now then, Team Fortress 2. Liverpool 3. Sorry, I'll stop this now. Lastly, there's Portal, and if you're a regular viewer, you'll understand how insane these words feel coming out of my mouth, but I can't think of any criticism for it. I'm serious, this is the most fun you'll have with your PC until they invent a force feedback codpiece. Absolutely sublime from start to finish, and I will jam forks into my eyes if I ever use those words to describe anything else ever again. I've always felt that if I wanted the kind of experience most JRPGs offer, I'd just watch a random anime series box set while pausing it every 5 minutes to fiddle around with the remote control. And eat some shit. So, Paper Mario then. There are 3 games in the series now, and story-wise there hasn't been much variation between them. You play as Mario in some bizarre Keanu Reeves-themed universe where everyone is a cardboard cutout, and the main plot involves A. some big villain's devious plot to destroy the world, B. a lengthy quest to acquire 7 or 8 colour-coordinated magical MacGuffins that have been scattered to various themed lands for some utterly contrived reason, and C. the princess getting kidnapped at some point because kidnap ordeals are the sole moments of interest in her otherwise miserable parasitic existence. The platforming is kind of bland and samey, which is weird for a Mario game, but I forgive that, because they earn so many points by removing turn-based combat that Super Paper Mario would have to release flesh-eating beetles into my house before I started seriously marking it down. During the second chapter, Mario is required to work and earn money to pay for some of the mindless vandalism that comes naturally to action RPG players, and the best way to do this is to press right to run around in a giant hamster wheel for no joke somewhere around a quarter of an hour. That's if you're thick. If you're smart, like me, you weigh down the D-pad with one of your roommate's figurines and go off to amuse yourself. That's right, you have to amuse yourself while playing a game being something ostensibly designed to amuse. And if the player is doing this, then something has clearly gone wrong. It's an extreme but by no means the only example of Super Paper Mario's attempts to lengthen gameplay with all the subtlety and self-respect of a retarded mammoth in a 9 Inch Nails t-shirt. The Medal of Honor series has been going on since 1999, meaning that it has officially been going on longer than the actual Second World War did. And if you put together all the games, films and TV shows that have depicted it, the Normandy landings alone probably lasted somewhere within the region of 6 months. Fortunately, they all seem to realise how incompetent they are and rely on Boyd utterly to show them where to go and personally complete all the objectives like the teacher on a school trip. Unfortunately, the enemy soldiers seem to make the same realization and will instantly start shooting you and only you the instant you expose 1 square inch of your lithe, supple body. And war stops being glorious and starts getting annoying when you're replaying the same fucking bastard section for the 19th fucking bastard time because you don't possess the bionic cyber vision necessary to spot all 15 hidden fucking bastard snipers who can draw a bead on and decapitate you before you can say Uncle Sam. As evil as the real Nazis were, it seems they weren't evil enough for the developers, and so the accuracy is a little bit skewed against them, and then it's skewed a little bit more, and then it's put in a thumbscrew until it resembles a slinky. I'm no historian, but I'm pretty sure there wasn't an elite branch of stormtroopers who wore gas masks, wielded miniguns, and could take 3 sniper bullets to the forehead before they died. And I'm also pretty sure the Nazis didn't have a gigantic armoured concrete tower that can only be described as a doom fortress. Which is weird, because going into this game I was kind of under the impression that the Medal of Honor series tended towards historical accuracy, main characters' bullet-absorbing tenacity notwithstanding, and indeed that seemed to be the case until Johann Gasmask showed up. By the end I wouldn't have been too fazed if Hitler appeared riding a giant robot spider. I'll keep the plot summary of Phantom Hourglass short because I'm sure all you clever college-educated nerds could hazard an accurate prediction as to the main elements. Princess Zelda gets herself into a pickle and has to be unpickled by the hero who is called Link on the few occasions when I feel mature enough to not abuse the enter your name feature, and Fagballs at all other times. Fagball starts off with just a sword and has to fight his way through quests to collect tools that will open new ways to go, including a boomerang, a bow, a grappling hook, blah blah blah. Yeah, we've all been here before. Hang on though, because there is something else connecting this game to Wind Waker. Remember how everyone complained about how it had too much monotonous sailing? Well, Nintendo took all those complaints on board, then threw them into a fire. The sailing returns like a greasy sex offender returning to your room at night. Instead of being in full control though, you draw the path you want to take and the boat follows it automatically with a punishing lack of urgency. Don't think you can just set it down and go off to a trendy juice bar for a few minutes, because on the way you're certain to be constantly assailed by monsters and clipping issues. Hourglass's other gimmick is that after each dungeon you have to go back to the starting temple to find out where to go for the next one, and while not wishing to be confrontational, this aspect of the game can fuck right off. Imagine if anyone else did it. Imagine if Valve released Half-Life, then a few years later they released Half-Life again with exactly the same plot but with better graphics, different level design, and maybe one new gun, like a tube that shoots lemons. How about next time you want to make make a Zelda game, you don't call it Zelda. Maybe instead of fag balls, the main character could be someone else, like a dog. And maybe instead of Hyrule, it could be set somewhere original, like feudal Japan. And maybe instead of collecting tools to access new dungeons and areas, you could collect magic spells that are cast by, say, painting funny shapes with a magic brush. Hang on a second, I'm going to write this down. Clive Barker's Jericho by Clive Barker follows the adventures of, and when I first read the plot synopsis, this is the point where my eyes almost rolled straight out of my skull, an elite military unit specializing in the paranormal and consisting of 4 tough manly men and 3 hot sassy chicks of various racial backgrounds with only a wheelchair-bound member required to complete the spectrum of political correctness. They're flown in to investigate some kind of disturbance in some ruins in the Middle East and end up travelling through 3 different time periods in some kind of evil pocket dimension where some ultimate evil demon thing is trying to do something or other. The plot's about as twisted and impenetrable as a granite octopus. The game is just littered with bad design choices like Worthy Farm after the Glastonbury Festival. Just as an example, in the second level I was faced by a number of wartime pillboxes that diced the entire team to festive confetti the moment they came within 50 yards. Eventually one of those helpful hints that games flash up when they feel sorry for you for being so obviously retarded appeared and told me that one of the girls would run up behind the pillbox and drop a grenade in it if I pressed a certain button while in a certain position. Excuse me, Jericho, for not possessing the kind of clairvoyant space brain necessary to instinctively know something that has never until this point been mentioned and indeed will never be used again. If you make your horse walk past soldiers in the countryside, they'll all somehow twig that you're up to no good and become hostile, but if you hold down a button that makes the horse go a little bit slower, then suddenly nobody cares. Maybe the Holy Land has some kind of rigidly enforced speed limit, but watching a dashing warrior and his magnificent steed dawdling along the road like a Blackpool donkey ride is not my idea of pulse-pounding action. Another good way to blow your cover is to randomly stab innocent civilians, and trust me when I say that forcing yourself not to do so is a lot harder than it sounds. Those wacky, fun-loving lepers have this hilarious tendency to shove you with all their retard strength and send you flying ye olde mosh pit style, which I feel makes me well within my rights to lamp them one, but then everyone turns against you because apparently it's not as funny when you do it. And then there are the beggar women who will latch onto you like a lamprey eel and constantly run in front of you, whining for coins in a manner scientifically designed to get on my tits. Then I give them a gentle, discouraging knuckle sandwich and they run off yelling like I'm the asshole. It hits particularly close to home for me because this is pretty much how all my relationships turn out. It all began when I and some colleagues were around a friend's house for completely heterosexual reasons, and we broke out Guitar Hero 1 on easy mode in celebration of our manliness and complete lack of desire to fondle scrotums. And once we'd reached the point where the game wasn't yelling at us all the time for sucking so much, that is, sucking at the game, not sucking each other's dicks or anything, it was a lot of fun. Its triumph was in following the philosophy that if you're going to make a game designed to humiliate the player, the least you can do is have some decent music in it. So while we all stand up there holding undersized, squeaky Fisher-Price plastic guitars as you told a small yappy dog, we could at least close our eyes and pretend we were on stage with Joan Jett, holding a small yappy dog. Don't believe the lie of Guitar Hero 3. It's actually the 4th title in the series, the 3rd being Rock the 80s, which I haven't played, but the day I fork out $70 for an expansion pack is the day I swallow razor wire, pull the end out of my arse, and floss myself to death. The first time we played, the very first power-up either of us acquired crippled the other player and ended the match within 5 seconds in a clear case of what is known as Mario Kart syndrome. As for the whole Legends of Rock thing, perhaps Legend of Rock singular would have been less misleading because the only one is Slash from Guns N' Roses. Well, there's some guy from Rage Against the Machine too, but wishing no offence to the man, if he's a Legend of Rock, then a grilled cheese sandwich is haute cuisine. On the whole though, it's just not as good as tonguing another man's balls. I mean, as it used to be. I'm not gay. It's half past the future and humanity is up on the galactic political stage having a dick-waving competition with a variety of alien races who all speak English and pleasant North American dialects for some reason, but I guess it's preferable to all those Wookiees in Knights of the Old Republic gargling in your face all the time. The main guy, whose last name is Shepard and whose first name in my case was Titty, is a human soldier guy who gets a new job as a galactic peacekeeper guy called a Jedi. I mean Spectre. Soon enough the shit hits the hyperdrive and it's down to Titty to save the galaxy. Now pad out my last few statements until this paragraph is roughly the same length as Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, then read it out loud to yourself while occasionally flinging the text across the room so you have to go pick it up again and you'll have a pretty good idea of the Mass Effect experience. People often say to me, Yahtzee, you Calapigian Superman, how can you, a game writer yourself, complain about a game having too much dialogue? I would reply, for the same reason that a hairdresser is entitled to complain when someone fills their car with shampoo. The best writing in visual media is succinct and punchy, something a lot of webcomic writers need to understand. A new Nintendo console has been dancing a merry jig in the international marketplace for quite a while now, so we're well overdue for another cynical attempt to make the Mario 64 Lightning strike again and restore life to the lurching atrocity that is Nintendo's main franchise. For me, the interesting relationship is the one between Mario and Bowser. I mean, on some days they fight to the death in fiery climactic showdowns, but on other days they go go-karting together, play tennis, even team up in some of the RPGs. Sure, he kidnaps the princess a whole bunch, but no one seems to begrudge him for that anymore. It's just what he does. It's like begrudging a dog for licking its own balls. And you could transplant the head of Joseph Goebbels onto the body of a praying mantis and it would still compare favourably to Mario Sunshine. The final boss fight in particular is about as hard as the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man's dick in the presence of his his grandma, but then I guess Bowser is pretty much resigned to inevitable failure these days. Oh yeah, and the implementation of a live system is still as unnecessary as it was in Mario Sunshine, and as it has been ever since we stopped designing games for amusement arcades run by people destined to be the villain in an episode of Scooby-Doo. All in all though, I'm left wondering where this series could possibly go from here. I mean, once you've gone into space, everything after that feels like a step backwards unless your next film teams you up with Freddy Krueger. Maybe they could do Super Mario Universe, but that's really only postponing the issue. Of course, Nintendo always has the option to axe the franchise and start a new one with new interesting characters. Then maybe they could start a snow shoveling business in hell. What I love about Silent Hill is its absolutely peerless storytelling, which when compared to the general standards of writing in the games industry makes it look like Charles Dickens joining a forum for Invader Zim fanfiction. Sooner or later it was inevitable that some prick would try to take my blue balls in hand and wring out some money to pay off his hookers, hence Silent Hill Origins, a new game exclusive to the PSP of all things, outsourced to Climax Studios, a Western developer who couldn't have missed the point worse if they fired in the wrong direction and the point was in a different country altogether. Clueless Burke de jour is Travis, trucker and professional retcon, who gets embroiled in the dealings of Silent Hill's friendly neighborhood death cult circa 7 years before Silent Hill 1, when the town was still getting into the swing of things. He's also got a dark secret and a troubled past, the Silent Hill equivalent of a season ticket. But Origins is a pretender, nothing more. It does nothing but reiterate themes the series has already covered more competently. Call me a sniffy, games are art, phagmosexual. To me, the Silent Hill series is over, and if Silent Hill 5 convinces me otherwise, then I will remove 3 of my own vertebrae, curl my spine back, and eat my own arse. Once upon a time, there was a little engine that could, the CryEngine to be precise, developed by Crytek for the games Far Cry, Crysis, Chrysanthemum, and Jesus Christ Superstar. Of course, with amazing graphics comes the inhumane treatment of processors. Crysis is apparently designed for some kind of hypothetical future computer from space. I played it on a brand new gaming PC resembling the Monolith from 2001, constructed from magical obsidian by the proud dwarves of Middle-earth, and it still chugged when things got busy. There is one section towards the end where you're forced to pilot a futuristic helicopter jobby, and, well, imagine that you'd just woken from a 20-year coma, celebrated the occasion by drinking 6 bottles of Mad Dog 2020, then were called upon to pilot a light aircraft bearing a cargo of hippopotami. That's what controlling this section is like, and they expect you to enter dogfights in this thing. That's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube with your elbows. What would you get if you took the corpse of J.R.R. Tolkien, ground it into a fine powder, and snorted it off the doughy breasts of a prostitute suffering from Tourette's syndrome? Well, first you'd get a throat full of dead writer, then the police will probably want to talk to you, and you'll no doubt make an enemy of Mrs. Tolkien. What you probably won't get is The Witcher, because it's a video game and more easily acquired from your local electronics retailer, you idiot. What quickly becomes obvious is that Witcher is very much a PC-exclusive game, which are typically designed to be as complex and unintuitive as possible so that those dirty console-playing peasants don't ruin it for the glorious PC gaming master race. The first warning sign is that the manual is thick enough to beat goats to death with, and then once you get into the game, the interface is just a few steps shy of Microsoft Access in terms of friendliness. The reason why this is a first impressions rather than a full review is that I found the game to be so boring and stodgy that I couldn't play it for more than a couple of hours before deciding I had to do my laundry or wash the gimp, or anything that would mean I wouldn't have to put myself through more of it. And as a general rule of mine, a game that feels like work generally isn't looking at a good write-up. The Witcher was not fun for me, but you might have a better time if you're incredibly boring and if it's been decades since your last sexual encounter. And if that's the case, stop watching my reviews, Dad. Umbrella Chronicles is a difficult game to comprehend. It appears to be a celebration of Resident Evil's storyline, which to my mind is like celebrating Andrew Lloyd Webber's devilish handsomeness. Part of Resident Evil's charm is that it still takes itself seriously, despite having the most atrociously written story and dialogue of any product of human endeavour since Hulk Hogan took one too many clotheslines to the head and decided he could act. Do you remember what the villains from Captain Planet were like? How they'd steal an oil tanker and deliberately run smack into a beach to teach all the sea lions a lesson in complacency? Do you remember wondering why they didn't just sell the oil at huge profit and not have to get beaten up by a big blue man in little red pants? Well, that's basically the Umbrella Corporation. It's controlled by a handful of people who in any sane world would have been sectioned under the Mental Health Act before they could even finish presenting their proposal to murder 90% of their research staff. I have a bad feeling about this, announces Jill Valentine after having been repeatedly savaged by the undead, demonstrating her vital intuitive ability to sense danger about an hour after it has commenced. Where did all these webs come from, wonders Chris Redfield aloud while staring directly at a giant spider. The plot deals with a conflict in a Middle East country that tactfully goes unnamed, undoubtedly because the state of that region fluctuates so much that it could be a waterslide park by the time this comes out. A sequence that stood out for me was a moment where you quantum leap into the body of a chap dying slowly and horribly of radiation poisoning in the aftermath of a nuclear explosion, dragging his useless legs around a wasteland steeped in graveyard stillness before finally breathing his last unloved and unmourned thousands of miles from home. It was an unflinching and effective statement which cheered me up immensely, and not just because I hate my fellow man. It was the turning point that shifted Call of Duty 4 in my eyes from above average gun wank to actually pretty excellent gun wank. Having been very politely requested to not be involved in the voting and to stop throwing rocks at your cars, I've taken the opportunity to present a personal retrospective of 2007 in my trademark psychotic manner. Take it away, myself. I'd like to take a moment to name 2007's best gun-toting stoic. Honourable mention goes to old hand Gordon Freeman, sadly disqualified for having a face and a name, who reappeared this year in Half-Life 2 Episode 2, Millwall 1. Part of me wonders if, like how the invention of realistic virtual sex will wipe out the human race within one generation, simulated rocking will kill the real-life music industry, now that it's no longer necessary to actually learn how to play an instrument, show up for gigs, stay up all night snorting drugs off people's body parts, and still be alert enough the following day to dodge casually thrown beer bottles, bright young fellows with rock potential will instead use up their talent learning how to press buttons in the right order. Admittedly, you don't get the benefits of constant sex or embarrassingly large amounts of cash, but you also don't have to drop dead at the age of 35 from a combination of exhaustion, drug abuse, and bullets. Meanwhile, on the console battlefield, it was a significant year for the PS3 more than any other. At the start of the year, she'd been freshly kicked out onto the stage to nervously dance for our amusement, and it was hard to shake the feeling that she wasn't quite ready for prime time. Her shows were too expensive and she only knew 2 songs, but over the last year, the girl's been exercising and eating properly, and I think it's fair to say she's become a decent rival to her peers, the Wii, who only knows like 4 or 5 songs, and the Xbox 360, who frequently comes onto stage drunk. But what could have been a better closing moment for 2007 than the release of a new Duke Nukem Forever teaser? Yes, it seems that 3D Realms have been doing something other than giving each other piggyback rides for the last 10 years. In a stroke, all the anticipation we haven't felt since 1998 returned like a taser gun to the base of the spine. I just hope that 3D Realms understands that if this game doesn't turn out to be history's greatest contribution to human culture and the cure for at least one type of cancer, then I and every other reviewer on Earth are going to saw its bollocks off. There are games for all kinds of people. There are games for rappers and games for graffiti artists and games for people who feel up girls on Japanese subway trains, but there have never been any decent games for white supremacists. That is until Uncharted, Drake's Fortune. Oh yeah, and there are QuickTime events. Let me speak directly for a moment. I sort of understand why developers keep using QuickTime events. I suppose an arbitrary reflex test is as good a method as any to get through a cutscene, but if you must use QuickTime events, make them a core part of gameplay, don't just throw them in randomly every now and again. Uncharted has got maybe 3 or 4 in the entire course of the game. What that basically means is that it's impossible to be ready for them. QuickTime events are fine if it's reasonably possible to get through them on the first go, but otherwise they're just irritating. Jericho did this as well. I know I can't stop developers using QuickTime events, but you can stop doing this at least. Oh great, exclaims Nathan Drake sarcastically whenever a gaggle of gun-wielding darkies show up, rolling his eyes with knowing complacency until you want to reach into the screen and beat him to death with his own hair. It would be very narrow-minded of me to say that all Japanese cartoons suck. That's like saying that all glam rockers are paedophiles. The fact is that there's bound to be at least one thing to your taste in all the different varieties of anime, whether you're into samurais or giant robots or serials about awkward young men very pointedly not having sex with a selection of eager women. But it would be fair to say that there are certain popular trends in anime that tend to set off my cynicism alert. I would list them, but thanks to Capcom I don't have to. Now I can just point at Devil May Cry 4 and say pretty much that. The abominably lengthy intro cinematic contained a total of 3 high-energy bombastic fight sequences, and my entire contribution to them was to sit on my arse taking a drink every time someone defied the laws of physics. There was no reason why these fights couldn't have been playable, but the game seemed afraid that I would cramp its style. It's like Devil May Cry 4 invited me out to a bar, then left me alone in the corner nursing a strongbow while he busily tore up the dance floor with a giggling society girl. Eventually she was called away by her cackling friends and he came back to our table with fresh drinks and apologies, but I won't forget this betrayal, oh no. If you're having trouble telling them apart, remember that Nero is a pussy, while Dante is more of a cunt. Take the recurring board game segment. There are certain rooms throughout the game which for some demented reason you're not allowed to leave until you've thrown a big spiky dice a sufficient amount of times to make a big representation of yourself move across a bunch of squares. There's only one path, so there's bugger all strategy involved. It's just pointless delays, like a hallway full of balloons. After the first time it happened, I assumed it was just some idea that the lead designer's girlfriend had that he'd agreed to put in for the sake of his sex life and we'd never see it again. But then for the entire last hour or so of gameplay, it came back, bigger and more of an embuggerance than ever. This led me to deduce that the developers genuinely thought that it wasn't terrible game design, and that in turn led me to deduce that the developers were all pillocks. People often ask me, Yahtzee, you Herculean exemplar. You have so much to say about what makes a bad game, but what is your measure of a good game? One of my measures of a good game is one that teaches me something. Burnout Paradise, for example, teaches me that if Princess Diana honestly couldn't survive a trivial little crash like that, then the girl must have been made out of wafers. Burnout Paradise's unique selling point is that it's an open world game, one of those games usually pitched with a sentence beginning like Grand Theft Auto, but. In this case, like Grand Theft Auto, but a hell of a lot more broken. The idea is that you can drive freely about the city as much as you like, and when you start a race, all you're given is a finishing point, allowing you to choose your own route. Fine in theory, but theories are treacherous things that can at any moment disintegrate like a biscuit raft. Australia, as most intelligent people know, is populated by the descendants of convicts sentenced to exile for cutting purses and throats on the streets of London town. As for the people whose purses and throats were cut, their descendants all now work in the games industry and conspire to continue the punishment of Australians by stapling an arbitrary number of months onto every single motherfucking release date. So while we're waiting for stuff like No More Heroes or Rock Band to finally deign to show their faces down here, let's take out our frustrations on some shitty dinosaur game. I don't know when the games industry in general fell out with health meters. Maybe someone threw a big party for video game interfaces and Mr. Health Meter got drunk and acted like a tit, so now everyone shuns him. Whatever, games just don't have health meters anymore. When you're hurt, you just heal up by sitting in the corner sucking your thumb for a few seconds, which makes things a little patronisingly simple, but is very accommodating towards players who happen to be the 3-year-old children of syphilitic lepers. Turok goes the extra mile by ripping off the entire cryopod scene from Aliens verbatim, except with Sigourney Weaver replaced with an overly masculine stupid haircut. No change there then, ha ha ha, raucous laughter. Long ago, in the mists of time, when main characters didn't need to have biceps bigger than their faces, and when bump mapping was just something cartographers did to their wives, there lived adventure games.
This shy, thoughtful tribe was known for its great storytelling tradition and ruled the great PC gaming plains for many years before mysteriously dying out around the onset of the Quake era. Some blame the aggressive expansion of neighbouring first-person shooter tribes, but personally I think it's more to do with the fact that most of them were shit. If you find the Japanese offensive, then you'll find this game offensively Japanese. The main characters are a brash youth with no voice and stupid hair and his aggressively cute monkey friend voiced by some painfully shrill harpy thing, and the antagonist is a hot angry girl in a miniskirt. Now all it needs to do is dispense used panties and depress the Chinese. Come to think of it, Wank and Sticky is a game with a lot of needless attachments, like the fact you can buy hints, totally useless while the internet still exists, or the practice of awarding points based on how quickly you solve puzzles, which I frequently took personally. But if you complain about unnecessary additions, you're just being a tosser. It's like complaining about, say, a perfectly good hot dog because the vendor is the Boston Strangler. You can still enjoy the hot dog and just try not to make eye contact. I'd be the first to admit that in my reviews I tend to go straight for the gay jokes too much. Somehow a burn becomes doubly funny when you imply that the subject also likes it rough from men with hairy bums. I've honestly been trying to cut down on them lately, but Jesus, look what I've got to work with. Two inseparable muscular men, one big and grizzled, the other young and spunky, running around in gimp masks, knocking down big missile erections, plainly sexually uninterested in the only woman of their acquaintance, and despite ostensibly making a lot of income as contractors, they can only afford one parachute between them, which they're a little too eager to share. We're quickly and frequently reminded that the military is shit, and so is everyone in it, while mercenaries are unstoppable immortal badasses who make tons more money and like it rough from men with hairy bums. No, bad Yahtzee! It's just a little bit tacky to combine juvenile power fantasy with real-world politics, but I don't want to beat Army of Two with that when there's perfectly good bad game design I could beat it with. It's repetitive and broken and nothing you haven't seen before. If you can play Gears of War with one hand and Splinter Cell with the other, then you don't need to play Army of Two. And make sure you film it because that's a pretty impressive talent you have there. No More Heroes is a Japanese game based around Jedi lightsaber fighting and starring as the main character a hopeless pop culture obsessed social reject who spends most of his time whining, getting strung along by women and being a generally unlikable fuckbend. So at least you can't fault it for understanding its audience, predictable joke. You play Travis Touchdown, the aforementioned specky narcissistic weirdo characterized just a little bit uncomfortably close to home, who buys a lightsaber and vows to become the greatest assassin in the world. You know how it is when you buy a barbecue, you throw a lot of parties for a while to fool yourself into thinking it wasn't a waste of money. But the awkward thing about No More Heroes, or at least about reviewing it, is that like Killer 7, it's intended to be satirical, and when there are problems with the gameplay, I'm worried that it was intended to be that way as a satire of, I don't know, pretentious video games, and if I were to call it out on that, then I'd lose my credibility with the cool alternative crowd. But then I remember that any game designer who sacrifices fun to make an artistic statement is obviously stuck so far up his own arse that he's in danger of choking on his own head. For a while I was seriously all set to name Condemned 2 as my game of the year. Right up until around the halfway point everything was slinky, forensics clever, combat visceral, atmosphere pants-wetting. But experience has taught me that while declaring a game shitty because of the first few hours is perfectly valid and completely professional, you should never assume that a good game will stay good. The first warning light flicked on a few hours in when the creepy doll robot suicide bombers showed up, but at that point I didn't think the worst, so the subtlety had been cut down a notch. I can dig it. The second warning light started blinking shortly afterwards in the museum level when I suddenly found myself swinging a broadsword at lads in full medieval armour, but hell, it was still reasonable. I'd hardly expect them to be hefting fire extinguishers when swords are available. The warning lights only went off like Blackpool Pleasure Beach when characters started bandying around the phrase ancient mystical cult because I realised I'd been through this before. Condemned 2 is a textbook victim of indigo prophecy syndrome. There's a final boss sequence in Condemned 1 in which you run through a dark claustrophobic labyrinth with the serial killer in hot pursuit. It's really intense and genuinely terrifying, and part of what makes it so effective is that it takes place in a normal house, exactly like, oh say for example, yours, right down to the psychotic serial killer who lives under your bed and is standing behind you right now, but don't look because that'll really piss him off. Condemned 2, by contrast, ends on a stupid sci-fi tower thing resembling something the Combine would throw together if they were all drunk, and a piss-easy final boss fight which you win by shouting at him so loud his brain explodes. I wish I was fucking kidding. I really haven't been looking forward to this. Last week I accidentally left my copy of this game in a friend's console, and I was genuinely pleased. It meant I could review Condemned 2 instead, a game I actually had some interest in. But there comes a time when we all must pay the piper and eat shit's waffles. I don't even know why I'm reviewing this game. Oh wait, yes I do, because you dipshits wouldn't stop crying about it. I've never liked most fighting games because I argue there's got to be something wrong with a game in which you can spend 15 years practicing and learning every slightest nuance and still lose to someone randomly smashing buttons. At our grouping, for example, since maybe just under one of us had been boring enough to read the manual, our deathmatches could probably have been faithfully recreated by hurling the controllers down a flight of stairs. And I must confess, engineering a scenario in which Mario can brutally beat the stupid out of Princess Peach while the crowd screams for blood is very satisfying, and it would be pretty sweet to watch Solid Snake get Sonic the Hedgehog into an armlock and slit his throat. Oh wait, we can't, can we? Because those characters aren't unlocked straight away. I hate it when multiplayer games do this. You bring a hot new unreleased title to a party and you're the toast of the evening until you discover that half the fucking content has to be unlocked in single player, and then the toast of the evening becomes a damp square of cold mush. Get this, if you want to be playing as everyone's favourite Azure attention deficit woodland mammal, you have to play for 10 cunt gargling hours. Well, we didn't have 10 vagina swilling hours, Nintendo. We had one vodka fueled evening, most of which we probably wouldn't even remember the following morning. Considering lest we forget how prominently Snake and Sonic featured in their fucking hype, there really needs to be a law against this sort of thing, preferably one of those maritime laws that lead to someone getting tied to a mast and flogged. Who the fuck is Marth, and why is unlocking him considered a reward? Oh, and thanks Nintendo for putting in a character from Mother 3, a game you're never going to fucking release outside Japan, despite the fact that I can fucking guarantee that more people would play play it than Mario Kart 11 billion the next generation. I've just realised I haven't even mentioned what kind of game it is yet, because I assume most viewers already know, but if you're one of those girlfriends of viewers who don't actually play games but likes watching these videos anyway because they secretly want to fuck me, God of War is basically Devil May Cry meets Ray Harryhausen, but with less of the stop-motion plasticine of the latter or the smirking bugger cunts of the former. And like Devil May Cry, what we're really here for is the combat, which, as I've already said, is satisfying to the point of eroticism. There's something almost balletic about Kratos swinging his chains around, disemboweling a succession of gurgling dance partners, and there's actually skill to it. Mashing square and triangle will serve up to a point, but sooner or later you'll have to start learning how to get around attack patterns, you know, like you've actually got a brain and shit. So after all that, let's return to our tissue-thin veneer of consumer advice and talk about where the Chains of Olympus is worth getting. Well, if you felt God of War needed to be about 4 or 5 hours longer, then go for it, but you wouldn't be missing much if you held out for a PS2 port. Don't expect anything new, but it's still fun, especially if you picture all the monsters as your childhood bullies. Yes, how do you like that, Brian Payne? We'll see how many dead legs you can give me when you've got a priceless historical artifact sticking out of your bonce. Funnily enough, I don't get direct hate mail as often as you might think. I guess you're all afraid I might ignore you to death, but the Brawl review brought in an unprecedented and yet not entirely unexpected amount of negative feedback, and I thought rather than just dispense bile all the time, it would be nice to sample some for a change, and perhaps also take the opportunity to respond to some of the slightly more valid arguments. So without further ado, go Team Retard! By the way, it's alright, you can swear on the internet, your mum probably isn't going to read it. I know, because she's too busy being fucked by me. If you don't like it, you just point out every little thing that's bad about it. Okay, I put my hands up, he has me there. I do point out every little thing that's bad about a game, but then I'm a critic. It'd be weird if I didn't. If I put people's balls in my mouth for a living, I'd be a prostitute or possibly a GameSpot employee, but I criticise, so I'm a critic. This year's morally flexible everyman is Nico Bellic, an Eastern European mercenary who was last seen helping overthrow the Combine in Half-Life 2 and who arrives as a penniless immigrant in Liberty City. As is always the case with this series, Nico must reach the top by climbing up a big pile of stolen cars, bodies and escort mission. Painkiller is a first-person shooter from 2004 by Polish developer People Can Fly, perhaps best known for their previous title E.T. for the Atari 2600. Not really, of course. Painkiller is the only game by People Can Fly, which makes it all the more amazing that Painkiller is fucking awesome and can kick the arse of most big-name mainstream titles and have them for breakfast afterwards, which is a shame because if the game blew goats I could have made a funny joke like Painkiller, you'll certainly need one. It's like after the developers were resigned to making an unsophisticated shooter, they vowed to make it the most stylish unsophisticated shooter ever and spent all the leftover escort mission and fetch quest money on tarting it up. Levels range disjointedly from giant cathedrals to military bases, and the level design gives me a big fat architectural stiffy. There are over 50 distinct varieties of dude to murder, all amazingly well designed. They don't give me any kind of stiffy though, that would be gay. But all you really need to know is that there's a gun that shoots shurikens and lightning. I wish I could make something like that up. It shoots shurikens and lightning. It could only be more awesome if it had tits and was on fire. I know what you're going to say. Yahtzee, reviewing a JRPG? Perhaps I shall quickly look outside to make sure the sky is not falling and the seas are not running red with blood. Ho-he ho-he ho. At one point in the second part of the game I was given the clue 30 plus 74. Assuming your brain is located inside your skull and not your rectum, you can probably hazard that this adds up to 104, which was the pretentious name of a pretentious clothes shop near my starting location. But I couldn't actually go there because the street was closed off. It only opened after I went to another nearby location and sat through another dialogue-heavy cutscene in which I was bold-facedly told the answer to the puzzle. This is not interactive storytelling, this is just reading. I know Japan has a very different culture to the West, but I will never understand why they like the visual novel style of game so much. The porno ones I can sort of understand, at least there's the promise of titties to keep you motivated, but most of them play like choose-your-own-adventure books with half the pages ripped out, which kinda goes against the whole idea of gaming. My only previous experience with the Elder Scrolls series was a brief spell of Morrowind during the previous planetary alignment, in which I ran around some muddy countryside in the rain for a few hours, fending off weird subhuman creatures, so basically it was just like Glastonbury Festival. In Oblivion, you start off in a dungeon in the Imperial Palace. You're never told what crime you committed. I guess you're supposed to fill in that blank for yourself, so I choose to believe I was in there for shagging the Emperor's wife and daughter at the same time while playing a rock guitar solo on the desecrated corpse of God. For a game that is obviously trying so hard, Oblivion is one of the least immersive RPGs I've ever played. The world map is huge. Granted, if you intend to walk from one end to the other, you'd better pack a few sandwiches, but frankly, take one good look around the moment you first emerge blinking into the daylight and you've pretty much seen everything. It's like they took 200 square yards of medieval English countryside, added a few wolves, then copy-pasted it until it was roughly the size of Yorkshire. And then there are the characters. They all have this weird, stiff, unreal quality about them, indicating that Cyrodiil is apparently located inside the Uncanny Valley. And that's before you try to talk to them. Besides the main characters, there are about 100 million individuals with maybe 2 actual personalities between them, neither of which are particularly well characterized. One crazy beggar woman switched between a grackled drawl and a well-spoken aristocratic tone from line to line, so either she's pulling a very inept con or the dialogue assignment is fucked. The attempt to create a procedurally generated NPC conversation system was courageous, but then so is jumping into a skip full of used syringes. I think it's safe to say that very few people were madly trampling babies underfoot to grab haze on launch day. I know whatever atrophied dregs of enthusiasm I had breathed their last when I glanced at the back of the box and saw that it was an outdoor first-person shooter about space marines. Whoopsie fucking do, I thought. I look forward to the vehicle section with horrible steering and spending half the game hiding under a table waiting for my health to regenerate. The overall message of Haze's story is that war is bad and there are no true heroes when death is on the menu, but combining that with whiz-bang shooty fun strikes me as trying to have one's cake and eat it, a phrase I've never really understood. I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to want to eat a cake that you have. There's not much else you can do with a cake except maybe hide in one if you're a stripper. Sorry, lost my train of thought. The series sells itself right there under the title as tactical tactical espionage action, which implies a gritty, pulse-pounding, sneaky bollocks runaround, and while that's certainly present, it always seems to be occupying the same space as a stiff and inefficient third-person shooter and the paranoid manifesto of an internet conspiracy theorist with several gunmen short of a grassy knoll. I'm going to recount as much of the story as I can before my brain starts to hurt. Solid Snake is a cloned mercenary who is suffering from premature aging due to a planned obsolescence scheme worthy of Microsoft. He lives with his support character and best friend, Otacon, and the two of them have adopted a child together. That oozing sound you just heard was made by all the world's homoerotic fanfiction writers simultaneously emitting torrents of hot lady spunk. Anyway, Solid Snake is tasked with the assassination of his evil cloned brother, who is dead, but lives on through his possessed arm, which was grafted onto the body of— oh Christ, I can't go on, this shit is bananas. Somebody once said that a politician is a person who can talk for hours and never actually say anything. If that's true, Hideo Kojima could run for government and be Emperor of the Universe by mid-afternoon. Every now and again, though, the game snaps you out of your exposition-induced trance and begrudgingly lets you actually play it for a bit, and in these moments the gameplay is adequate but severely cluttered, like it's suffering from the gaming equivalent of Asperger's syndrome. All the characters who haven't had a poignant death soliloquy yet show up, whether we like it or not, including Mr. and Mrs. Oh Christ Not You Cunts Again from Metal Gear Solid 2. So you've looked at Penny Arcade, seen the massive amounts of money, prestige and money those guys get for 9 panels a week, and decided that you want in on that. Many gaming webcomic artists have thought the exact same thing. In fact, let's not beat around the bush, all gaming webcomic artists, except Penny Arcade obviously. The first thing to do is to be or move in with someone who can draw, forcefully if necessary. If you don't know anyone who can draw, and you yourself draw like a flipper-handed freak child who just discovered MS Paint, don't fret, just write excessive amounts of dialogue and hide the hideous art with huge speech bubbles. If you don't know how to draw or write, are a functionally retarded quadruple amputee and can only communicate by banging your head against a Wacom tablet, that's still no reason to quit. You can wipe your ass with a page of Mega Man sprites and there'll still be someone on Comic Genesis who'll tell you that it's brilliant. Now you have to make your comic funny, and reading most existing webcomics one could be forgiven for thinking that humour is entirely optional, but believe it or not, there are people who laugh at that stuff even if it's just the author's mum. Fortunately, the advantage of running a gaming webcomic is that gaming humour is incredibly easy. All you have to do is apply video game logic to the real world for comic effect. For example, in say Gears of War, you have to push the analog stick to move forward, when in real life you have to continually put one foot in front of the other. This might not sound like A material, but trust me, phrase this right and there's a fortune to be made in cafe press shirts. If that doesn't work, go for the edgy crowd and do a comic implying that Mario does Luigi up the arse. And if that doesn't work, just go on about the cake being a lie. Let's say for sake of example that you're sick of making companion cube jokes and suddenly do a serious storyline about your female character having a miscarriage. Obviously you'd need to have several blood clots in your brain to think this is a good idea. You're established as a wacky humour comic, so this is going to be an awkward tonal shift at best and hugely disrespectful of the subject matter at worst. Your most hardcore supporters will feebly attempt to go along with you on this, smiling nervously at each other as they would around a mentally unstable friend with a shillelagh, but mean-spirited embittered cocks are going to call you out on it. At this point there are many ways you can respond. I don't see you doing anything better, I can do whatever I want with my comic, you're just jealous because I get more readers, and other equally flawed arguments, but above all else never admit defeat, because the bigger a douche you are, the more traffic you get as spectators line up to see you jump around the monkey cage screaming and flinging your poo. So your gaming webcomic package is complete. All that's left to do is gather it all together and throw it in a fucking bin, because you're a talentless cultural pollutant who deserves to suffocate to death on a bag of porridge. There comes a time when you have to stop ignoring something, a lesson that could well have been learned by those people who lived next door to Auschwitz and thought all the smoke was coming from an unusually screamy pie factory, which by the obvious link of Nazi Germany brings me effortlessly to LEGO Indiana Jones. I've been ignoring the whole LEGO LucasArts coalition so far, partly because, as you'll recall from my Psychonauts review, LucasArts is run by douchebags, but mainly because it sounds utterly retarded on paper. I mean, once you accept LEGO Star Wars, where does it end? Playmobil Battlestar Galactica? Duplo Firefly? Meccano Dune? Yeah, I'm done milking that joke. I guess at first I'd— wait, I've got another one! Sticklebricks Babylon 5? Sorry. I guess at first I'd filed LEGO Star Wars in my massive brain database under the same heading as Barbie Horse Adventures and Bratz Hey Kids Let's All Dress Like French Tarts. Obviously Indiana Jones is a different kettle of chimps to Star Wars though, what with all the death and face melting and all that business with the monkey brain, so the most sofa hiding moments of the trilogy are toned down to be kid friendly, LEGO characters being as unfazed by dismemberment as the drugged up prostitutes in my van. Brutally beating Short Round into a pile of bloody plastic giblets 14 times removes all feelings of antipathy you've ever had towards the character. Multiply the Indiana Jones nostalgia factors by how much you enjoy adventure game scavenger hunts, and divide by the number of times falling off the floating platform levels in Mario Sunshine made you want to slice your own face open with a broken Wavebird controller, and you'll get a number which somehow corresponds to how much I recommend LEGO Indiana Jones. I'm not a mathematician, obviously, but I had fun with it, and so might you. It'll certainly tide you over while we wait for the really hot release, Fuzzy Felt Deep Space Nine. So Edward Carnby from the very first Alone in the Dark is somehow still alive, and thankfully no longer made out of folded crepe paper, and wakes up in modern-day New York with a bad case of plot-convenient amnesia and being hunted by rips in the wallpaper. Then, all restrained, gets tearfully bade farewell and put on a bus to Azerbaijan,
down when a load of buildings blow up and Edward finds himself forced to fight against his standard satanic apocalypse scenario while coming up with several contrived excuses to drive cars over ramps in slow motion, creating a feel somewhere between the Prince of Darkness and the Dukes of Hazzard. He gets joined by a female sidekick who sweeps the horrible game character awards, taking most obviously crowbarred love interest, most irritating, least useful to gameplay, least necessary to plot, and lifetime achievement. Perhaps the crowning moment of her hideousness is when she nearly dies and the game forces you to press a button sequence in order to revive her with CPR, although the spiteful cow never actually dies, no matter how many times you deliberately fuck up. "Hey," said Terry, "let's have a damage system where you actually see persistent wound decals on your character's body." "Okay," replies Gonad, "but let's put them on the outside of his clothes so they look like someone glued slices of ham to his jumper." "Hey again," says Terry, "how about a dangerous gooey black floor that becomes neutralized by bright light?" "Okay again," says Gonad, "now let's make the flashlight incredibly ineffectual against it and make it a one-hit kill." Then a broken and jaded Terry starts sniffing glue while Gonad goes into the fetal position and softly giggles to himself. I suppose I should have realised something was up when I saw that the chapter skipping feature was proudly touted on the back of the box. So not only did the developers think that not having to play the game was a point in its favour, but there were apparently so few other selling points worth mentioning that they put it in the marketing blurb. My lack of foreknowledge of Age of Conan will ensure a fair review concentrating on the outsider's experience rather than complaining about the depiction of Daisy McSwordboobs from page 74 paragraph 3 of Conan Gets a Fixed Rate Mortgage or whatever. Dialogue trees are included to allow you to get to know the NPCs, but frankly I find it difficult to care about the personal lives of gormless pissants who spend their whole lives standing in one place picking their nose, and when all I want is their quest, I'd prefer to not have to ask them how their day's going before they can get to the bloody points and tell me how many wombats they want killed. I don't think I met a single other player who didn't either run up and chop my tits off or run away assuming I'd do the same to them, and every other word in the general chat field was some kind of racial epithet. My theory is that all that solo playing they make you do at the start puts you into the wrong mindset. There's nothing wrong with being a small part of something bigger than yourself. That's how an MMO should work. Solidarity, teamwork, joining 40 friends to go stomp on a night elf's face. Age of Conan makes the same mistake as the school system by telling everyone that they're special, thus turning them into entitled twat donkeys. So an appropriately mediocre E3 has a limped past for this mediocre year in gaming. Nintendo have proudly announced their intention to make the Wii do what it was always supposed to do anyway, while Microsoft and Sony busily compete to see who can rip off each other's consoles the most. And of course a gaggle of upcoming game trailers were wheeled out to stir up excitement, but since the eventual quality of most games is going to be essentially determined by spinning a roulette wheel where numbers 1 through 30 have all been smeared with pus, I thought I'd better fly in and point out that we're still living in a cruel corporate-run society that treats you like a wallet mounted on the back of an entranced magpie. Now, I thought the Sands of Time trilogy was the best game series of the last console generation. I'll pause for a moment so you can all go find your socks that just blew off. Overall, the characters were solid and the time-controlling gameplay worked crazy well with the sudden death platforming, to the point that now I feel my fingers unconsciously groping for the rewind button every time my toast lands butter side down. And it seems the new Prince of Persia is going to take all that and piss boiling oil into its eye sockets. Leaving aside for now that the music in the background sounds like someone teased a cat's bollocks with pliers for a few minutes while throwing ball bearings at a piano keyboard, the new Resident Evil 5 footage indicates that Capcom are counteracting the accusations of racism by including an African female sidekick resembling a white woman who's been dipped in tea. I'm sure the gameplay will be fine because Resident Evil 4 was fine and bugger all seems to have changed, except now we've traded up from infected Spanish peasant village to infected African peasant village, and the dialogue is still going to be so bad that every single line hurls you out of the experience like you're on a fucking trebuchet. Now then, Fallout 3. Those of you who are paying attention will no doubt notice that all these games are sequels, and for those of you who aren't paying attention, oi! Finally, a brief mention of Gears of War 2. That was it. Ninja Gaiden 2 is another graduate from the Resident Evil school of sequel numbering and the latest in a series of similarly titled games stretching all the way back to the NES, which boldly depict ninjas with superlative historical accuracy as simple peasant spies mainly concerned with undercover espionage and guerrilla warfare. Also, the Wii totally has lasting appeal, Atari have released some good games, and Cliff Bleszinski isn't an extremely sexy man. Among Japanese games, Ninja Gaiden 2 is almost unique in its immediacy. There's none of that Metal Gear Solid bullshit of cutscene dialogues that could fill a modest paperback, none of that Devil May Cry cockpiddle where the cinematics selfishly hog all the fun, none of that Zelda applesauce where you spend the first 6 hours on a starting island learning the subtle arts of waving a sharp stick around going yeah. What they do is briefly set the scene, then hand you a sword and go off to sit on the sidelines, patiently drumming their fingers on their knees while a legion of superpowered lepers pull your ring piece out through your throat. So it seems I might have let slip a few controversial statements about the Prince of Persia Sands of Time trilogy, what with phrases like best game series of the last console generation dribbling out of the corner of my mouth, since what I actually consider a good game is the eternal question that apparently keeps my correspondents up at night, and since the current state of new releases continues to be like staring into a big empty bucket made of air, I figured it was time to dribble out a few qualifying statements on the subject. The first attempt at a 3D Prince of Persia was the predictably named Prince of Persia 3D, technically a Tomb Raider clone in the same sense that a bucket of mushy peas and old twigs is technically food. It was horribly designed with bugs up the arse, a particularly uncomfortable place for bugs, and had a terrible habit of arbitrarily killing the player with leap of faith gameplay and unlabeled traps in open defiance of occupational health and safety protocols. Let's be more generous than reviewers of the time and say no more about it, except that it was a huge turd. The prince was a snotty, arrogant dick, in itself not unusual in games, but it's impossible to dislike him because A, he's snarky while being very humanly flawed, and B, if he ever really pisses you off, you can drop him down a pit as many times as you like. And I still hold up his sidekick cum love interest as one of the best female characters in gaming, and not just because her tits are reasonably sized,
surprised. She too acts like an actual human being rather than a MacGuffin princess with no brain or motor skills, or a supercilious badass action girl wearing enough armor to cover maybe 1/4 of a person. It seems that Ubisoft decided that emo culture was in, so they went around the office one morning and fired everyone who was smiling. Never stick your dick in a pudding. It might still be good pudding and you can spend all afternoon explaining that, but no one's going to eat it because you stuck your dick in it. The first game still very resolutely sits in my top 5 games of all time, but it could have been better. Like a variant of the Uncanny Valley effect, the closer a game gets to Portal perfection, the more glaring the flaws become, and their attempts to correct those flaws in the sequels were akin to removing flecks of dirt from a birthday cake with a shovel. But we live and learn, so let's move on and hope the new Prince of Persia will be as good as Sands of Time, and that my arse will sprout wings and fly me into space. There's a big evil chap on a tower who has the bluntest and most unreasonably large swords in the world, and everyone wants to have a go with them. Some people want to destroy them, some people want to stick them up their nose, and some people want to cover them in toffee and sell them at concession stands. The motivation and backstory for all the characters is so bloody complex you need a fucking flowchart to get to grips with it, which the game actually thoughtfully provides in one of its many dalliances with total fucking pointlessness. Frankly, I'm amazed the game even comes with a manual. All you need is a picture of the throw button and a big arrow pointing to it. There hasn't been a single round I couldn't get through by slinging my gormless opponent around like a drunken Amish square dance. Perhaps it was because I was playing on normal difficulty. Hang on, I'll try one on hard. Nope, same result. Which brings me to another reason why people might play a game, because Darth Vader's in it. Like the upcoming and inevitably awful Mortal Kombat vs DC, two franchises are climbing into a nice hot soapy bath together in a transparently cynical attempt to combine two fan bases into one beautiful pile of money. Frankly, it smacks of desperation, although I can't decide which of the two parties involved is slumming it the most. Let's not pay it any more attention, because like a small child putting the cat in a tumble dryer, that's exactly what it wants. Oh, I'm sure many games start off with some bright-eyed creative director foaming at the mouth with great ideas, but before long the stuffed shirts, a fetish design document to an angry dog, and the sheer amount of time and manpower that has to go into just making one character walk across a fucking room in the top-tier graphics engines of this day and age has whittled away all the great ideas in direct proportion to the director's will to live. And you know who I blame for all this? You! Yes, you, the public, especially you, Adrian. That probably isn't your name, but it was worth it to mess with the heads of all the Adrians in the world, and you're more interested in buying Master Chief novelty condoms than actual gameplay innovation. In fact, I don't know why I'm even talking to you. Piss off, close the browser and fuck off back to Gears of War. Has he gone? Good, I hate that guy. While time manipulation isn't by any means an unexplored concept, I promised myself I wouldn't mention Prince of Persia at this point because I feel if I suck that particular dick any harder it's going to drop off. But wait, I think I hear the nitpick train coming into the station. After a top-notch first half, there's a sense that the game is running out of momentum. Several of the later levels are literally copy-pastes of older ones, only solved with a different time power, which feels a little unimaginative. Oh yes, and here's a recurring scenario. 2 doors, 1 key. Key only fits one of the doors, the other one makes it break. No indication of which door is the right one, broken key cannot be recovered, have to start entire level again. That, Jonathan, is what we call a dick move, and I can't think of any reason for it unless the Xbox Live Arcade has some kind of minimum shittiness quota you have to meet. EVE Online does the impossible by making deep space boring and demonstrates that the best way to do that is to let nerds colonize it. With cards now hurled onto the table hard enough to bounce off and slice someone's eye open, let me back up. A few weeks ago, in the Age of Conan review that inspired so much delightful porn, I mentioned that all MMOs are trying to be World of Warcraft, i.e. full of grind and spiders. Well, some urban cavemen took exception to this remark and decided to fill my lughole about their personal favourite land of make-believe, EVE Online, an online space sim boasting a gigantic playable universe with enough simultaneous players to populate a small, whiny city with serious personal hygiene issues. Also, they advertise on The Escapist, which I sometimes interpret as a challenge. Another thing that sets EVE apart is the lack of a leveling system. The only way to develop your character is to train your skills. You do this by picking which skill you want to train, then turning off the game and going to sleep. Seriously, not that I'm complaining, but why am I being rewarded for not playing the game? Watching the little XP bar slowly climb in indirect proportion to my social skills is generally the only thing that keeps me going in an MMO. All you get from mining and doing missions and shit is money. Meanwhile, the market is full of weapons and ship add-ons that you can't fucking have until you've acquired the appropriate skills, so most of the time they sit on the shelves and taunt you like the painted wonders in the window of a Dickensian toy maker, taunting the small orphan child with their nose pressed up against the glass. The root problem with Christianity is that their god is supposed to be all-powerful and benevolent. It sounds like an easy sell, but when life turns completely to shit, you have to come up with all kinds of whacked-out reasons for why kindly old Jehovah saw fit to run over little Timmy with a combine harvester and leave him in a state of vegetative limbless agony for 18 years. So here's Too Human, the game Silicon Knights have been making instead of Eternal Darkness 2, possibly out of a crippling fear of money and success. It's based on a sci-fi reimagining, aka copy, of Norse mythology. The player takes the role of Balder, who in mythology was the Norse god of being a total pussy, who got his mum to call everything in the world and ask them to be extra special nice to him. Obviously this would be an awkward character to carry a badass action game, so the whole business with his mummy is carefully omitted while he's poured into the usual suit of magic power armor and turned into Space Marine hero number 580 billion. I have to admit though, the story is to be congratulated for taking the fiery thunderous personalities of the Norse gods and somehow turning them into a bunch of boring self-righteous robotic twats with all the warmth and emotion of a glass of water. In a monster spam sandwich, being able to aim at priority targets is vital. Too Human has to rely on an auto lock-on system that considers a giant missile-firing robot troll an equal threat to, say, an aggravated baked bean. Also, in the most erect of dick moves, some of the enemies explode when killed, granting incurable status ailments to you if you happen to be around, and you will be around, because while they're running up to you, your auto lock-on will have you shooting at a vicious-looking ceiling tile, and did I mention that all of the enemies can run faster than your slow-ass mummy's boy knobhead protagonist? It proudly announces its intention to be the first part of an epic trilogy, which in terms of tempting fate is right up there with a character in a horror movie uttering the words "everything's going to be alright," then getting their tits out, and you're left with a game experience that could be recreated by walking down a wide road in the middle of nowhere, stopping every 5 steps to crack yourself in the eye with a hammer. And the road is 1,000,000 miles long. And the hammer is made of wank. If there's one thing history has taught us besides not to piss off people called Genghis or put lead in your water pipes, it's that if you're going to make something incredibly good that becomes frighteningly popular, make sure it's the last thing you ever make in your entire life, because otherwise you get to spend the rest of your creative career struggling under the weight of high expectations and bricks. Will Wright created The Sims, a franchise which by shrewdly combining user-designed assets, the powers of a malevolent trickster god, and a massive amount of implied nudity, now annually makes about twice as much money as Belgium. So can his new game, Spore, possibly live up to that legacy? In short, no. In long, no. The chief failing of Spore is that it's trying to be 5 games, each one a shallow and cut-down equivalent of another game, with the Civilization stage even going so far as to be named after the game it's bastardizing. The rigid level-based structure and its constant changing of gameplay feels restrictive and schizophrenic. A much longer gradual development from cell to sentience with more options would have felt less like just ticking off boxes on a checklist. Wasn't this the whole appeal of SimCity, watching the slow transformation from scout hut in the middle of nowhere to sprawling carbon dioxide spewing urban vomit puddle? That's why it felt so cathartic to then drop Godzilla into the middle of it, watching everything you worked for collapse beneath his mighty tread, while crying and breathlessly rubbing yourself through your trouser pocket, or perhaps that was just me. Spore will never have the appeal of The Sims because of the excision of the human element. It wasn't simply controlling life that made The Sims popular, it was controlling life that resembles people we know, or optionally Batman. So I guess what I'm asking is, can brightly coloured monstrosities really compare to Batman? Short answer, no. The question this all raises is whether a remake should just blithely parrot the gameplay mechanics of the original, or take the opportunity to improve upon them with our enlightened future space technology. Well, the second one, obviously, you thick Burke. While the little big-headed characters are fun to look at, in big fights with lots of similarly sized chaps, it's easy to lose sight of the one you're controlling, and this becomes doubly unfair in big boss fights when the big boss's main strategy is to conceal your character's location behind their mountainous flab. At least in Golden Axe you could play as the Amazon lady and navigate by her unfeasible boobies. This is like watching midget-identical twins wrestling and trying to remember which one you put money on. Children will like anything, the stupid diminutive cunts, and you weren't any different. Games, or should I say the potential for games, has only gotten better as technology advances in indirect proportion to the worsening of your memory. When the gaming kids of today become the hairy whinging 20-somethings of the future, they'll be declaring that Halo 3 was miles better than a game of interstellar bum pirates on the astral thought planes of the universal overmind, and they'll be just as wrong then as you are now. I played both Zelda Twilight Princess and Super Mario Sunshine before I played Ocarina of Time and Mario 64, and I thought the first two were better in every buggering way. Drink down that burn sauce, fat boy. Also, I think Hitler was right. There's an insidious thought that frequently goes through the minds of gamers, and I'm not talking about the ones you get when Ivy from Soul Calibur's pants ride up, and which are perfectly natural for growing young men. Why does the CEO of our private military company have to do all the missions personally with no backup except for an Irish chopper pilot who abandons his mission when the enemy chuck anything larger than a scone at him? Actually, working alone might be for the best. The AI is so thick it might as well be living in a cave. On one occasion I called down a platoon of soldiers from a friendly faction to help me take over an enemy base. Every single one of them stepped right off the edge of the helipad, fell 6 feet and died. So the game's come out for practically everything with a screen: the Wii, PS3, 360, PSP, iPhone, ZX Spectrum, graphing calculator, microwave oven. But my thinking was that since the first thing anyone does with a Wii controller is swing it around making lightsaber noises, it would be remiss of me to play an actual official lightsaber game on anything else. A slight graphical downgrade is a relatively minor storm to weather for a game that actually feels like being a legendary unstoppable warrior magician rather than merely piloting one by remote control. Playing the game, however, it turned out that the legendary unstoppable warrior magician has a Zimmer frame and Parkinson's disease, and a slight graphical downgrade became it looks like it was left in a swamp monster's trouser pocket during laundry day. What I want to know is when LucasArts are going to drop this shallow pretense that the prequel trilogy wasn't 7 to 8 hours of concentrated agony drilled right into the the forebrain, declare the whole confused lot of it non-canon and move on. But no, they keep trying to make us accept it, like our parents making us invite the smelly kid with the hunchback to our birthday party so he can drink all the Fanta and determinedly wet himself. First there was that god-awful CG movie that looked like a 2-hour intro cutscene, and now this. Personally, I would slap George's hands away from the editing desk, give him a colouring book, then remake the prequel trilogy so that Darth Vader uses the Force to win breakdancing competitions and chokes to death anyone who utters the word midichlorians. You know how in most FPSs you're some kind of hybrid of man and refrigerator who could take an entire munitions dump to the face while the enemy all have armour made of whipped cream and skulls made of cake? Well, it seems going into this game everyone got their character sheets mixed up. The player can't survive more than a measly handful of bullets ripping through their flesh, while the armoured enemies can take so many rounds to the torso you'd think there'd be nothing left but a spinal column and the cornflakes they had for breakfast. They can spot you in pitch darkness even with your flashlight off, and they can shoot you from halfway to Neverland because their guns have magic accuracy that evaporates the instant you get your hands on them. I had to press quick save more often than the fire button, and this was on medium difficulty. I dread to think what the hardest setting is like. They probably give you a water pistol and replace all the enemies with fire-breathing golden lions. I was ambushed by a bunch of jerks on my way somewhere, killed one or two, hid behind a rock and quick saved, but then 3 of them all threw grenades and I ended up with a cloud of shrapnel instead of a face. After I quick loaded though, they suddenly didn't seem to care. I was able to walk up and affably chat to them about how their day was going. One of them even offered to guide me through the forest, but halfway through he ran off yelling, "That's him! Take him down!" I couldn't see anyone else around, but it seems he was talking to my processor because at that point the game crashed. They'll probably patch that at some stage, but they won't get any points for it in my book. You couldn't get away with releasing a buggy game in the cartridge and cassette days. You'd get sentenced to trampling under the company Brontosaurus. But I'll tell you the worst part about The bad news for you lovers of spectacle is that while Silent Hill Homecoming isn't that bad a game, my ask gets to stay right where it is. My promise was to chow down if the game convinced me that the series is not over, and I can already hear the words cop-out ringing in my ears, but even though it didn't give me too large a hernia, Homecoming doesn't feel like a successor to Silent Hills 1 through 4. Silent Hill Origins and the movie both did the same thing, so let me give a blanket statement here. Drop the fucking big-titted sexy nurses. The only reason they looked like that in Silent Hill 2 was because the spectacularly neurotic James Sunderland was looking for his sexy wife and they represented his frustrated libido. Alex in Silent Hill Homecoming is looking for his kid brother, who I very much doubt was a double D. It's like they had some kind of generic Hollywood movie checklist to fill in, which makes sense because the game borrows heavily from the similarly overdone Silent Hill movie, to the point that I half expected there to be a level where you play as Sean Bean doing something totally fucking irrelevant. The level of character customization is straitjacket-wearing, small animal tormenting insane, and after I'd gotten away into the game and kitted out my Cockney-accented psychopath with a black and red silk suit with bow tie, two-tone shoes and matching bowler hat, then started a mission in which I drove around the suburbs hosing things down with raw sewage, I suddenly realised that I was role-playing as some kind of extremely unsubtle cousin to the Riddler. I wondered if there could be a follow-up minigame in which I composed a set of elegant rhyming couplets pertaining to houses covered in poo. Saints Row 2 shows a much better understanding of its audience. It is fully aware that most gamers are dickheads, and if you give them any kind of freedom, their first instinct will be to abuse it. If you give them guns, they will shoot old ladies. If you give them cars, they will run over old ladies. If you give them aircraft, they will ascend to the highest possible height and hurl themselves out onto an old lady. The history of gaming technology has been one long quest for total realism, but now we're on the verge of it, I'm seeing that it's probably not worth the effort. The ultra-realistic games of recent years have been one long, gritty, depressing greyathorn after another, and it's up to games like Saints Row 2 to remind us that realism is an acceptable sacrifice if it means I get to throw old ladies into jet turbines. Your commanding officer even looks like Lawrence Fishburne, and sounds like someone from North London doing a terrible Lawrence Fishburne impression. Also, some of the enemies have very cheap attacks, like the little swarming scuttly buggers that make Isaac spaz out like someone dropped a caterpillar down the back of his shirt. It takes him a couple of seconds to shake just one off, so if you didn't see the swarm coming and your plans for the evening didn't involve being picked to the bone and strained through 100 tiny digestive systems, then you get to eat shit, space cowboy. Oh yes, and anyone who designs a security system so that it locks all the doors every time a monster shows up has absolutely no right to complain when they get their twats bitten off. You start off as a small apple-cheeked street urchin with a hilarious mullet who leads an almost Disney-esque life of idyllic wholesomeness, presumably to amplify the perverse glee when an equally absurd tragedy comes along and shits all over it. Your sister is killed and you get shot, thrown through a window and dropped 90 stories, but 10 years later you're all healed up and back for more, and having been through the worst of it, injury suddenly becomes a lot easier to recover from. In fact, every time you die, you pop instantly back to life with a paltry random experience deduction that can be instantly recovered by swatting the nearest gnat. Oh yeah, and you'll also get an unremovable scar somewhere on your body, but Peter Molyneux has yet to grasp that not everyone gives a shit. But really, here's the best strategy for combat. Pick an area of effect spell, pour all your points into it to get to level 4 or 5 as fast as possible, put a piece of electrical tape over the cast magic button, go to sleep, wake up, win game, have a well-deserved cup of tea, stalwart hero of the land. You know how in The Sims you could get a job as a mailroom clerk? You remember how you had to go into the office every single
single in-game day and play a little minigame where you fling envelopes into pigeonholes? Of course not, because it would have been really fucking boring. Yes, alright Peter, it's more realistic than dead monsters dropping pocket change, but you know what else is realistic? Working a desk job for 50 years in a cloying mire of tedium and self-hatred before dying of a disfiguring fatal cancer alone and unloved, forgotten within a decade. But you won't see many games about that, at least not until I finish the design document. And while we're on the subject, why can't I marry my dog? Fable 2 is less of a sequel, more like an upgrade of Fable 1, warts and all, that just tried to distract from the flaws by going, "Oh, look, he's a doggy, mash up his whittle face and call him Chips." Alright. If I had Liam Neeson's phone number, I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd nervously call him up and blurt out something about how Darkman was alright before slamming the receiver down and running away. Bethesda seem to be in the habit of hiring the biggest name voice actors they can find and having their character drop off the face of the earth before you've even picked a class. They did it to Captain Picard in Oblivion, and now they've done it to Oscar Schindler in Fallout 3. It's a shame because Liam Neeson's smooth, authoritative tones really helped ease the trauma of the game's opening, in which you are dumped bleary-eyed and bloodstained out of your mum's vagina and are then expected to come up with a gendered name and future appearance, which is a lot to ask from a newborn baby. The character creation sets the scene by having you play through various key points of your miserable childhood in a small underground room populated by around 10 people, and it's fairly effective at drawing you in, even if the all-important immersion does receive a little hairline fracture as you're leaving the vault when a window pops up going, "Just a moment, was there any part of your childhood you were unsatisfied with and wish to alter with your magical time-travelling false memory syndrome?" Rock Band came out in America in 2007, and I was drinking in the soundtrack waiting for Harmonix to tell us when we Australian residents could expect to be banging our heads so hard the corks on our hats could take someone's eye out. "I don't know," came the reply. "Sometime next year, maybe." An entire year passes. "Oh yeah," says Harmonix, wiping chicken grease from his face as dusky maidens fan his corpulence. "Still don't know about when we're releasing it, but we do know that we're going to sell the instrument separately and charge you 3 times as much as Americans paid. Now caper for my amusement, you dirty Australian monkey man." But on the World Tour soundtrack, for every Living on a Prayer or Band on the Run, there are 2 shitty emo rock warblers that no one's ever heard of. Admittedly, that's always going to be par for the course in games like these, but what the fuck is with having songs from obscure European bands with lyrics entirely in foreign? If you don't speak Spanish, singing them is like if the guitarist was required to play wearing mittens, or if the drummer were required to think. Plus, the music creation facility, while just a little bit too nerdy for me to consider actually using, will ensure that there will always be plenty of new songs online to challenge you, as long as you can tolerate endless MIDI renditions of the Neon Genesis Evangelion theme tune. Get either this or Rock Band, because it honestly doesn't matter which, although it's worth remembering that Harmonix are bigger jerks than Activision, which as achievements go has got to be worth some kind of medal. The trouble with being a freelance game critic is that no one sympathises with your problems. I can complain about how working from home, playing video games, reading porn and eating M&Ms is doing terrible things to my self-esteem and waistline, but you tell that to, say, a fireman and he won't sympathise for an instant, the selfish child-rescuing fuck. For most people, a demo for Mirror's Edge coloured their expectations a shimmering gold, only to realise once they bought the full game that they had been seeing the lights reflecting off a stream of piss. If you like the demo, just play it again 3 or 4 times and maybe make yourself some little cinematics with paper cutouts and you've pretty much played the full game. And it also wouldn't hurt to pay someone to stand next to you jamming shards of glass under your fingernails. Actually, I guess that would hurt. Quite a lot. I do like the starkness of the visual aesthetic, if you'll forgive the degree of faggotry in that phrasing. The bright colours against uniform white make an appealing change from gunmetal grey or dystopia brown. Effort has been put into realistic visual effects like blurring and changing of light levels like you're actually looking through real human eyeballs as opposed to a camcorder zipping along about 5 feet above the ground. And yeah, maybe it would be realistic for all that white scenery combined with bright sunlight to bleed together into a big blinding blob, but it doesn't help you avoid dropping off a building for the umpteen bazillionth time. "Oh," says Mirror's Edge, here manifesting as a designer with a bicycle pump embedded in his skull. "Well, since that's your problem, I guess I'll just set half the game in linear claustrophobic tunnels that undermine the very concept of free running, and then fill them with excessive bloom anyway." So he did, and then he ate his own shoes. Whether Left 4 Dead is good or not depends on what you ask for in a game. If you like a plot, there's certainly not a lot of that. Here are some zombies about sums it up. Other than that, you are part of a small team of the 4 unluckiest bastards in the entire Holocaust who get rescued over and over again, but it never seems to take. There's the old Vietnam veteran, the tattooed biker fellow, the hot college girl who probably spends every single night sleeping with her arse to the wall, and there's also a nebbish office worker type who doesn't seem to need to shave if you're looking for a character you can actually identify with, although he is black, which probably fucks that up a bit. As I said, it's up to you whether you think this is all worth $50, but then of course I paid $100 for Mirror's Edge, so apparently I'm a retard. Sonic the Hedgehog is sort of a rock star of the video gaming industry. He fronted a succession of extremely popular titles, made enough money to buy St. Paul's Cathedral and grind it into a fine snortable powder, hung around with a lot of suspiciously effeminate young boys, abused a number of forbidden substances, spiraled downwards as inevitably as Al-Qaeda Airways, weathered a few very embarrassing attempts to re-grab the spotlight, and now his shows are attended only by people's dads, who can only shake their heads in despair at the unshaven, drug-addled spaz on stage, whose pathetic spurts of activity masquerading as entertainment only serve to highlight both his and his audience's mutual decline into inexorable piss-dribbling old age. All he needs to do now is hang himself on a doorknob while having a wank. The only slightly tolerable parts of Sonic Unleashed are the nighttime manhog levels, mainly because you could put Sonic in a skirt, unfocus your eyes, and convince yourself that you're playing God of War, a much better game. The leprous retards of Sonic Team have basically been lost in their own little world for the past few years, but occasionally something penetrates their malformed 3-inch thick
skulls. Recently, for example, the notion finally broke through that most people want Sonic games to be about Sonic, and that his ever-expanding entourage of neon woodland creatures can all go dive under a tractor. So the cast of anthropomorphs is cut down on this venture. Tails makes an appearance, but he was with the series while it was still good, so I'll let that one slide. But we're also introduced to a new, helpful in massive inverted commas, pixie-like character who is like Navi from Ocarina of Time with a cheese grater taped to her face. This isn't the game for you if you like jumping right into the action. Come to think of it, this isn't the game for you even if you don't. I'm not sure what kind of person could consider this the game for them, but they probably live in a cave and subsist on raw fish. The Prince of Persia series, as it stands, can best be equated to a man who owns a goose that once, when the conditions were exactly right and after being fed a particular kind of food, laid a golden egg. He then spent the next few years experimenting with the goose's bedding and vitamin intake, hoping to recreate the ideal conditions, and after nothing more than a couple of bronze and silver eggs plopped out, he went the scientific route of chopping it into fritters looking for the secret. And after that didn't work, he hastily stitched it back together, dressed it up in glittery fabrics, and attached some googly eyes, and that's the new Prince of Persia, an appealingly gaudy appearance that fails to disguise the fact that the old bird is dead inside. I know publishers have this idea that American audiences can't relate to anything but other Americans, but as weird as these words sound coming out of my mouth, perhaps we could at least try giving them credit. I imagined all the Prince's lines being delivered in a thick Indian accent, and he became much more appealing, although it did feel like the game was taking place in a 7-Eleven. Honestly though, his cheerfully carefree attitude and occasional funny line eventually caused me to warm to him, although that could just be because he was standing next to his sidekick, Elika, a character alongside whom even a dead goose with googly eyes attached would seem charismatic and appealing. Letting the player choose what order to do the levels in sounds good on paper, but it means that they have to all be very similar, or the difficulty curve gets fucked up. To utterly misquote Benjamin Franklin, he who trades pacing for gimmicky open-world freedom deserves neither. Frankly though, the core platforming and lovely scenery do a lot to make up for the flaws, almost suspiciously so. Every time I feel myself getting worked up about the characters or the combat, a nice relaxing parkour sequence mellows me out. Those cunning Ubisoft twat rackets.